Hey everyone, this is a video on adding and subtracting fractions. This is a review video from class. This is the front page of your second pack, and it was a quick reference guide on how to work with fractions. I want to talk about the top two, which is adding and subtracting of fractions. And you'll see that I have highlighted the most important concept here. You can't add and subtract fractions unless the bottom number is the same. So sometimes you'll have a question where you do have a common denominator, and in that case you will keep the common denominator and you will just add or subtract the numerators and then just make sure you're in lowest terms. But most likely you're going to have two fractions that have different denominators. You need to find a common denominator. The best way is to have the least common denominator. That will get you to your answer faster. But as long as you have a common denominator, you're okay. We discussed in class 3 different methods of finding that common denominator, and I want to kind of run through those, and then we'll do a few problems. Okay, again, in your fraction pack, this is how to find a common denominator. And I list, and we talked about the 3 different methods. Let's talk about the first one. Method 1 is the one that I absolutely love because it will really save you time if you can do this. The first example is 1/5 plus 5/10. So obviously we have 2 different denominators. 1/5 plus 5/10. Some of you may even be saying right now, 5/10 really isn't in lowest terms. That actually 5 is half of the bottom number, so we could actually reduce that to 1/2. And that's pretty cool if you can see that. You can always reduce your fractions, you don't have to. I'm going to leave it as 10 because I want to use this as an example for method number 1. The question we're asking ourselves is, can the small number in your denominators divide evenly into the larger number? If that happens, that means you can use the largest denominator. You can never use the smaller number. I can't divide 10 into 5 because that will give me a decimal number. The largest number of your 2 different denominators is where you start in terms of finding whether or not you have a common denominator. So 10 is the bottom. You got to start at 10. It's got to be 10 or higher. In this case, 5 does divide into 10 evenly, so that means I can use 10 as my common denominator. And the reason that I like this method so much is that it saves time, because you'll notice that the 5/10 is already in tenths, so we'll just move that over. Now I only have to make an equivalent fraction with the top fraction, and I do that by asking myself, 5 times what would give me 10? Well, that is 2. So if I do that on the bottom, I have to also multiply the top. That's how you make an equivalent fraction, by multiplying top and bottom by the same number. So 1 times 2 is 2. So I'm ready to go. I have 10 as my denominator, and then I'm just going to add 5 and 2, which is 7, and then the final question is 7/10 in lowest terms? And if you run through those 6 questions, you will find that 7 is odd, it's actually prime, 10 is even, so the only way this could be reduced is if you could divide 7 into 10 evenly, and that doesn't work. So we are done. Okay, method 2. Method 2 is what most people like, which is to take the denominators and multiply them together. And the example given is 2/6 plus 3/4. Again, I like to write them vertically. So let's take a look at that. And we have the denominator of 6 and 4. So they are different, and that means we can't add yet until we find a common denominator. This method is simply to multiply the 2 denominators. That will work every time. You can always multiply them together. It might not be the least common denominator, but it is a legal common denominator, and we're going to do that. We're going to multiply 6 and 4, which is 24, and that's going to be our common denominator. And now we have to convert both of these fractions to equivalent fractions. So 3/4 is something over 24. And the way you figure that out is to look at the 4 times what would give me 24. And that's 6. So 3 times 6 is 18. And on the top fraction, 6 times 4 is 24. So 2 times 4 is 8. Remember, whenever you want to make equivalent fractions, you have to multiply the top and bottom by the same number. Okay, so now I have 8/24 plus 18 over 24, so 24 is our common denominator. And I'm just going to add 8 and 18, and that'll give me 26. But we're not done. One of the reasons that we end up with, this is an improper fraction because the top is higher than the bottom, is because we didn't use the least common denominator, which is fine. We still have the skills to take care of this. So let's take our improper fraction. You can just say to yourself, 24 goes into 26 how many times without going over? Obviously, we can only get one 24 out of there, so it's 1. If I take 24 out of 26, there's 2 left, and that's over 24. And we know that's not in lowest terms because 2 will divide evenly into 24. So the answer is 2 and 1/12. Why? Because 2 divides into 24 evenly. That means you have 1 on top. If you remember the 6 questions to ask yourself, 1 is on top, and then you just have to say 2 times what gives me 24, and that's 12. So that's our final answer, 1 and 1/12. Again, the reason that we ended up with an improper fraction, one of the reasons is that we're not using the least common denominator. It still works, we just have a little bit more work to do. Okay, so going back to this still, the number 2 question, 2/6 plus 3/4. This will take us into method number 3, which if you want to find your least common denominator, then you need to look at the multiples of each of these numbers to find a common multiple. So let me give myself a little room here. So we have 6 and 4. Six and 4. So we need to find multiples. And you do that just by doing times 1, times 2, times 3, times 4. So 6 times 1 is 6. 6 times 2 is 12. 6 times 3 is 18. 6 times 4 is 24. And the multiples of 4, 4 times 1 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 3 is 12, and there you go. We found our least common multiple, which is 12. And let's just see what happens if we use the least common denominator rather than just multiplying the two together. Okay. So if you look on this page, then method number 3 was to find the least common multiple. And this third example, I did it with the number 2, but also in number 3, we have 1/3 and 2/7. And I list out the common, the multiples of 3 and 7. Remember, it's times 1, times 2, that's your multiples. 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, and the multiples of 7, 7, 14, and 21. That's actually our least common denominator would be 21. And then you make your equivalent fractions. So basically, most students tend to multiply together the two denominators, which is fine. Or if they can automatically see what the multiples are, sometimes you can do that in your head pretty fast. But if you're in a situation where you're taking a time test, sometimes the best way to find a common denominator simply is just to multiply the two together and then just reduce them as necessary. All right, so again, in your pack, this was adding and subtracting fractions when they had the same denominator. And I say to you, why am I giving you a page like this where they already have common denominators? The reason that I do that is I want you to get in the habit of not adding your denominators. That's never going to work. That's not correct. A common denominator means you just keep that number. So in all these cases, number 1, the answer is 8. The denominator is 8. Number 2, the denominator is 10. Number 3, the denominator is 48. You always use the common denominator. Okay, and again in your pack, now we have different denominators. So let's do a couple of these. Okay, number 1 is 7 over 8 plus 3 over 4. And right now, automatically, I can see I have an 8 and I have a 4. I do not have common denominators, and I need to get one. So I can use method number 1, which I love. If you take the smaller denominator, you just want to see if that will divide evenly into the larger denominator, and it does. 4 divides into 8 evenly. That means I can use the largest denominator, and we like that because it saves us some work. It means we can use the 8. So 7/8 is already in 8s. It's already done for you. That means you only have to make an equivalent fraction with the bottom one. 4 times 2 is how I would get 8. So then I'm going to multiply the top number by the same number of 2. And 3 times 2 is 6. So using my common denominator of 8, I will add 7 and 6. And I get 13. And again, that is improper. The numerator is larger than the denominator. So you can either ask yourself, 8 goes into 13 how many times? Or, remember, fractions are just undivided division. So make a fraction house. 8 goes into 13 how many times without going over? Well, 8 times 2 would be 16, and that's too much. So I'm only going to take 1 out of there. 1 times 8 is 8, and 8 from 13 is 5. I'm done because 5 is less than 8, so I'm just going to write the 5 over the divisor of 8. So the answer is 1 and 5/8. And 5/8 is in lowest terms. 5 is odd and 8 is even, and I can't divide 5 into 8 evenly, so I'm done. Okay, let's do a subtraction example. We can actually do the one below it. It's actually the same fractions, but this time we're subtracting 7/8 minus 3/4. And again, I can see right away I don't have a common denominator, and method number 1 works. The small does divide into the larger number evenly, which always means I can use the largest denominator, never the smaller one. Never, ever, ever. And that's good because now 7/8 is already in 8s. I just moved that over, and I only have to convert my bottom one. 4 times 2 would give me 8. 3 times 2 is 6. So I have a common denominator of 8, and I'm subtracting this time 6 from 7, and that is 1. And we know that is in lowest terms because I have 1 on top. So we are done. Okay, let's jump down to number 4 and do that one. 3/7 plus 2/5. I'm going to look at my denominators. I have 7 and I have 5. I don't have a common denominator. I certainly can't divide 5 in the smaller number 5 into 7 evenly, so that first method is out. So I would use the second method. I would multiply the two together. And if you actually would do your multiples, you would find out that that's going to be your LCD. That will be your lowest common denominator. And 7 times 5 is 35. So now we have to convert both fractions. 7 times 5 would give me 35. If that's the case, then to make this equivalent, I would have to multiply the top number by the same number of 5. And 3 times 5 is 15. On the bottom fraction, 5 times 7 would give me 35. So to make this equivalent, I have to multiply the top number by the same number. And 2 times 7 is 14. This is addition. 35 is my common denominator. And 15 and 14 is 29. So now I have to ask myself, that's a proper fraction, top number is smaller, is that in lowest terms? And it is, because 29 is odd. And it can't divide into 35, so we are done. Okay, I'm going to do a few more examples, but if you got the hang of it, you could probably just close out this video, or you can stay and watch a few more. This comes also from your pack. I believe it's on the next page, adding and subtracting fractions. Number 1 is 7/4 minus 8/5. 7/4. Minus 8/5. So here we have two denominators that are different. The 4 doesn't divide into 5 evenly, obviously. So I'm just going to multiply 4 times 5 and get a denominator, a common denominator of 20. And then I just have to make equivalent fractions. And I'm good to go. 5 times 4 is 20. And 8 times 4 is 32. On the top fraction, 4 times 5 is 20, and 7 times 5 is 35. So I have a common denominator of 20, and I'm going to subtract then 32 from 35. And that answer is 3. And then I just have to ask myself, is 3/20 in lowest terms? Well, 3 is odd and 20 is even. So 3 would basically have to divide into 20 evenly, and it does not. So that one is done. Okay, let's try maybe number 4. I have 5/2 minus 13/12. Okay, so the smaller denominator, I can see right away that I don't have a common denominator, so that means I can try method 1. The smaller number will divide into 12 evenly, so that means I can use the larger denominator. Never, ever, ever the smaller one. And we like that because then this one is already done. It's already in 12ths, which means all I have to do is the top one. 2 times 6 would give me 12. To make this an equivalent fraction, if 2 times 6 gives me the bottom number, then I have to multiply the top number by the same number. And 5 times 6 is 30. So I have 12 as a common denominator, And 13 from 30 is 17. And you'll notice that that is an improper fraction. So you need to take that out of improper. You can either ask yourself, 12 goes into 17 how many times without going over? Well, 12 times 1 is 12, and 12 times 2 is 24, so it's only 1. And if I take 12 out of 17, that means I have 5 left. 5 over 12. And that's in lowest terms because 5 is odd and 12 is even, and 5 doesn't divide into 12 evenly. But don't forget, whenever you have an improper fraction, fractions are just undivided division. Make a fraction house, make sure you get everything in the right place. 5 goes into 17. I'm sorry. Back up. Let's write that correctly. It's 17 over 12. 12 goes into 17 one time. And if I subtract that, 12 times 1 is 12. So I have 5 left over. And I'm done because 5 is less than 12. And you write it as a fraction, 5 over the denominator. And you're done. Okay, so don't forget this front page, this little quick guide. You should always have this out when you're trying to refresh your memory on how to work with fractions. The top 2 boxes are add and subtract. And the most important thing is to remember that the denominators have to be the same. If they're not, you got to find a common denominator and then you have to make equivalent fractions. Once you do that, then you're ready to go, whether or not you're adding or subtracting. Lastly, make sure your fraction is in lowest terms, and you're done. Hope this helps, and I'll see you in class.